I want to point out, to me, what's really important in the actual article here about creeds. It says that it lists Nicene Creed, Apostles' Creed, Creed of St. Athanasius. And notice what it says about them. It says they are to be thoroughly received and believed in the sense that they have always had in the Catholic Church. That means we don't reinterpret the creed to mean something that we think it should mean. We're going to believe it the way that the fathers and the saints have always believed it. I don't know if any of y'all have seen this, but if you were to get enraged, Google Sparkle Creed.
Oh, I've seen that.
Okay. That poor lady is on her way to not heaven.
Right.
To not heaven. It's awful. But so when we talk about the creeds, we are not going to reinterpret them to fit our sensibilities. We're going to understand them the way the fathers wrote them and the way they're received by the church. So that's a really important point, because to this day, as far as I'm aware, the Episcopal Church still says the Nicene and Apostles' Creed. But they sure as heck don't believe it in the sense that it was always believed. And I also want to point out another thing. I'm going to move our class forward a little bit. One other thing I want to say about it is the creeds were never meant to be a complete summary of everything we believe. So I want to here's something I want to tell you. The creeds dealt with controversies in their days. We're going to understand the context of the creeds. Now, they're applicable for all time, but they dealt with specific context the church was dealing with. Because this is what happened one time. I had someone come to me and good Baptist, and said, well, we see the creeds, there's nothing in the creed about the Eucharist. There's nothing about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And my remark is because everybody believed that. They weren't having to define something everybody already believed. They were defining things that were up for debate. So that's why if you go like, well, why doesn't the creed mention this point of theology or that point? They're not meant to do that. They're asking them to do something they were never designed to do.
Well, that's like people saying that such and such isn't in the Bible, so we shouldn't do it.
Right.
Well, the Bible isn't a social history; it's a religious history.
Right.
So if it didn't touch on the religion, then it wasn't mentioned, because everybody had a culture. I mean, the culture, and you didn't have. That wasn't the question.
Exactly, and we actually got into that in our last class. The Bible is not a catechism. It's not a blow-by-blow doctrinal, this is what you do in the church. So the same thing is true for the creeds. It's not meant to cover everything the church believes or talks about. We're going to start with the Nicene Creed. And to understand it, we're going to have to understand a little bit about the First Council of Nicaea in 325. So we're going to be going over the historical context, which means we're talking about Constantine the Great. And under that, we'll be addressing, was there a new church under Constantine? Here's spoilers. No, there wasn't. We're going to talk about the problem that Nicaea fixes. And then we're going to talk about why is the creed changed? Why is the Creed of Nicaea sometimes called the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed? Then we're going to talk about the creed itself, and we're going to talk about the theology of the creed. And under that, we're going to be, basically the creed tells us what we believe about God. That's basically what the creeds are addressing. They're going to talk a little bit about sacraments in church, but my belief is, I believe this is true, the better we know God, the rest of our theology follows suit. And I just lost my...
Now, with the, would you say, so the creeds, are they specifically like historical and cultural explanations, or to not take them out of context, essentially? Are they forever rooted in that?
Well, I will say this.
Mm-hmm.
To fully understand what the creeds are getting at, you need to understand a little bit of Greek and a little bit of what they're saying in the creeds. We have a translation of the creed. So, yes, there does need to be some context explained, and some of the things probably aren't as applicable as they once were. And furthermore, I would argue that the English language is somewhat inadequate to explain fully what the creeds are driving at. I believe it's providential that the Lord developed the church in the context of the Roman Empire and in the context of a Greek culture that had language that could talk about this very well. So, English itself probably would be poorly used in the context of the creeds, but we'll get into that. So I think I answered your question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and it basically essentially kind of reminds me of like the Acts and Letters of the Apostles too, in terms of like they're telling an issue, and then that truth is kind of forever applicable in the church.
That's the best way to understand it. Like just as the Scripture has a specific historical context that we need to understand, it still reveals a truth applicable for all times. Same for the creeds.
Gotcha.
Nothing says history won't repeat itself.
Right. Okay. So, why 325? First of all, I want to talk a little bit about councils. So the first actual council of the church is in the Bible. It's in the Acts of the Apostles, the Council of Jerusalem. And that is very important because that's going to establish the precedent for all church councils to follow. If you notice, in the Council of Jerusalem, the apostles make a ruling that is authoritative and to be abided by. And it's sort of not something found explicitly in Scripture. You could even argue that they sort of overruled some of the Old Testament. So we establish a precedent that the church speaking in a council has an authority. Now we can say, of course, that those were the apostles, and they had authority that was greater than later church fathers. And I would say that's true, but still there's a precedent. The church can make decisions. The church can get together and make decisions. Why in 325 is there a great council? Well, first of all, there's multiple councils before 325. None of them are super important unless you're really a church history geek, but there are other councils that are local. They're local councils. So what happens is in 325, Constantine the Great has seized power over the Roman Empire. He is a Christian, and for the first time the church is not illegal. In fact, it's explicitly legal. I want to point out, Constantine did not make the Christian church the sole religion of the Roman Empire. Pagans were still allowed to do their thing. But he patronized the Christian church to a great extent, and now Christians could actually legally own property and not worry that someone's going to come and take their churches from them or kill their bishops or whatever. And so I want to say probably the real reason the church hadn't had a large council before this is because they had to be careful about what they were doing and where they were going. Constantine actually pays for the council, pays for people to come to the council. And the reason for that is because he is inheriting a situation in the church in which the church is divided. A man named Arius, y'all have heard of Arianism as a heresy of the church, is now saying that Jesus isn't fully God in the same way the Father is God. This is ripping the church apart. Constantine's not a theologian, but he's an emperor. The last thing he wants is the church to be divided when he's trying to consolidate his empire.
Right.
So he basically lets the bishops do their job, but he makes sure they assemble to do their job, to discuss what's going on and make a ruling, because he wants unity in the empire. And so that's the context of why it was so in 325.
And a small history note, because I'm lacking on historical knowledge of that period. Like Nero was still 200 years before this?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was. But had things gradually gotten better for Christian persecution
Actually,
at all?
I would say no.
Okay,
Yes and no.
okay.
It's a roller coaster.
Yeah.
It's in there. Just to let you know, there was
This hadn't been building, and he just kind of.
Right.
It's
So-
not like Goodwill had been building towards.
No.
it. He just right. Yeah.
There was probably so it's a roller coaster, and I want to point out that there is sort of this cherished myth of this church being persecuted and driven underground by the Roman Empire, and the Romans are out to kill every Christian everywhere. No, they didn't like Christians, but they were lazy. A lot of times, if Christians didn't bother them, they left them alone, and you started having high muckety mucks in the empire becoming Christians.
Okay.
So the governor of a province wasn't going to go out and murder Christians because he was also going to mass.
Okay.
So it wasn't all that different than the relationship with some of the Jewish population at the time.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, there were times of intense persecution,
Obviously.
and I want to point out that the Jewish people love to talk about how Christians persecuted the Jews, especially in the Middle Ages. The Jews viciously persecuted Christians in the early history of the church. And I'm not trying to justify what the church did in the Middle Ages, but what goes around comes around.
So they're spitting on Christians and peeing on churches in
Well,
Jerusalem.
they're going and dragging Christians before the emperor and saying, these guys aren't
No.
Jews.
No, I
They
mean
don't
now.
follow.
It's
Oh,
what they
they
did.
might be.
Right
It's what,
now.
it's what they did to Jesus.
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
that right
Right,
now
yeah.
in Jerusalem.
Oh yeah, that's
and it's become a big problem.
that's why I am not a huge fan of the nation state of Israel.
Yeah.
Contrary to a lot of beliefs that have sprung up regarding the second coming, the nation state of Israel is not God's chosen people. The church is true Israel. All right. So
One thing I'd like to mention is that under the Roman Empire, there were many cultures and many beliefs.
right.
And rather than trying to stamp out this and everybody believed the way they did, they tolerated all these different varieties as long as there was no conflict.
That's it.
Everybody, you don't have to believe what other people are doing, but don't pick a fight.
Exactly.
And
So
as long as you pay your taxes.
well, no,
Everybody had to
pay
big,
those taxes.
the big,
Yeah, I was
The
about to
big-
say,
Yeah,
it sounds-
real familiar.
the biggest thing was you could believe whatever you wanted. They didn't care. But you had to offer sacrifice to the emperor.
To the emperor.
So, and I want to point out, so the Romans deified their emperors. And so a lot of people will ask, well, did the Romans really believe their emperors became gods? I think the cult of the emperor was propaganda to get people behind the empire. A lot of their emperors didn't even believe that crap. In fact, I remember one of the early, I think it had been a Claudius, on his deathbed, he was dying, and he goes, "Oh dear, I'm becoming a god." That's what the guy said.
He was red-pilled.
I would turn that around a little bit.
Okay.
Because when we say God, that's a term we're using, that's not the term that they use theos.
Yes.
Which
Okay.
means something different. Because theos, the only thing that theos means is that it is a power that is beyond human control.
Right. We would say demigod
It's
probably.
obvious,
Yeah.
They were shocked if people would begin to think, there's no God. Well, of course there's a God. There are many gods.
Yeah.
Shyness is a god. Love is a god. You can't control those. They're a god. So the emperor was quite easy to think of himself
Right.
as a god because he was a power over which they had no control.
So-
it all made sense.
I think
Yeah.
the article
Yeah.
A makes a lot of sense in that sentence too.
Yeah.
It's not the God.
Yeah.
He's
So
a God.
just
A God,
just so
yeah.
that you know, before Christianity developed, there was someone who called himself the Son of God. It was the Caesar.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's why when Paul was talking about Jesus as the Son of God and Lord, that is revolutionary. That's going to attract the attention of the empire quickly. They've already got a Son of God and a
But
Lord.
if he's saying he's son of God, which God? I mean, because it's a pantheistic society. There
Right.
is no monolithic God. In
Right.
which case,
But you don't need to be specific.
right.
If you want to be specific, you'd say the chief god.
Jupiter or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So,
That makes sense.
so going back to what Ann said, so the problem that Christians ran into is the Roman Empire didn't care what they believed, but the Christians wouldn't offer. Mostly, it came down to taking up incense and throwing it on an altar before a statue of the
Yeah.
emperor. The Christians were like, not going to do that.
Yeah.
In fact, they literally had some Christians, some people that were friends of Christians would literally try to drag their Christian and just make his hand grab incense and throw it on the altar.
Right.
They didn't care if you believed that garbage.
Yeah.
You just had to do the thing.
Act of capitulation.
It's
Yeah.
something you couldn't even think about.
Yeah.
From their point of view, you're shocked. You won't offer incense to the emperor. I mean, I can't understand that.
Yeah, yeah.
Because anybody can offer incense. You go to offer incense to your God and also
Yeah.
to the emperor.
Yeah.
It made no sense to them
So,
until they got the notion that the emperor is not God.
yeah. So
That's when
Christianity
things-
ran into a problem because it was exclusivist. They said
Yeah.
there is no God,
Yeah.
and any of these other gods are demonic spirits.
Yeah.
And Jews were grandfathered in because the Jews got away with not offering worship to the emperor because the Romans actually respected the Jews. They thought they were weird, they thought they were
Yeah.
strange, but they had this
Yeah.
ancient religion, they were renowned for being wise. So the empire was kind of like, okay, Jews, you can do your thing. As long as Christians were seen as a sect of Judaism,
Yeah.
they were okay.
That was fine.
But Jews quickly figured out that Christians were getting under their umbrella.
Right.
And of course, the Jews had a vested interest in making sure Jesus of Nazareth was not worshipped. So they ratted the Christians out. And when the empire figured out Christians and Jews are different,
Yeah.
that's when they hammered on the Christians. So you're going to have sporadic persecution.
Yeah.
And in fact, the worst and the first and only systematic persecution of Christians was shortly before Constantine was under Diocletian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And he got really mad because the empire was in bad shape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was very pious, and he's like, we've got to go back to the old ways.
Yeah.
So he had his priest, try to foretell the future and try to appease the gods. The story goes that at one of the festivals in which he was a religious festival for the sake of the empire, whatever the priests were doing wasn't working, and one of them saw Christians making the sign of the cross. And they're like, it's not working because that Christian's here. And just so you know, Christians used to make the sign of the cross like we do when we read the gospel. It was like this. It's very subtle. It wasn't the
Oh,
whole
it
full
wasn't
body
the full-
thing.
yeah.
So the little sign of the cross on the forehead, which by the way, probably when Revelations talks about that God is putting a sign on their forehead, it's probably the sign of the cross St. John's talking about.
Yeah.
So they blamed the Christians, and Diocletian was like, it's on. We're getting rid of these Christians.
Yeah.
And this was the first time empire-wide you had persecution of the Christians, and it was the worst. And that was that in the early 300s? Or late-
I'm not sure.
But it's very recent.
Yeah.
And so the last and greatest persecution of the church was right before they found peace. And in fact, we'll talk about Constantine. I'll get into it some more. Have I moved over to St. Constantine the Great?
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
And I would just add two things, like the reoccurring themes, and not to like draw false equivalencies, but like one is capitulation seeming trivial.
Yeah.
Like, oh well, why don't you just do that?
Capitulate,
Like you
yeah.
said,
Yeah.
anyone can do it. It's not a big deal. Just
Yeah.
Yeah.
use this term,
Yeah,
use
so
this
easy.
language.
Mhm.
Buy into this. What's it? Why offend somebody or hurt somebody? And then the other thing is like socially acceptable punching bags for like a group of people
Yeah.
or
Oh, yeah.
spread. So
Abs-
historically there it seemed like every time there's
But-
something wrong, well, okay,
You
it's the
gotta
Christian's
blame-
fault, or
So-
You gotta
but-
blame some group.
Historians
Right.
will tell you that
Yeah.
when Nero burned Rome, he wanted to build new stuff. He probably started the fire and then just blamed it on the Christians as an easy scapegoat. He's like, those Christians started the fire.
Right.
Yeah.
Nero's as mad as a hatter, but
Yeah.
anyway.
But he wasn't even there when it burst. He was 30 miles away when
Just so you know, this has nothing to do with our class. Recently, some historians are trying to rehabilitate Nero and say he was actually a really great emperor. There's some evidence that a lot of the stories we have about Nero were made up later on by other emperors who didn't like him. So that's possible.
Yeah.
It's sort of like Joseph Stalin. You couldn't be sure if the statue that you were of the great communist leader was going to be there the next day. And if it was replaced, you had to pretend the other one was never there.
Exactly.
Which is basically where we're headed now in America, in my
Yeah.
Right
opinion.
now,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
here.
But,
Okay.
but we were talking about there's always got to be a scapegoat, and that's
Yeah.
kind of the human condition,
Yeah.
and that's what Christ is.
Absolutely.
If you want to control a
The
people.
ultimate
yeah.
scapegoat.
Yeah. We've talked. I'm not going to get into that, but yes, you're right.
Mhm.
Christ is both goats, by the way. There's 2 goats offered. He's both of them. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a much later class. So let's talk about Constantine the Great. All right. So Constantine is Anglicans. It was British. Now I don't know ethnically, but his family, his father ruled the province of Britain. He was born in Britain, lived in Britain. And he was raised under pagans. His father was pagan. His mother was Christian. Now, I have recently read some things by a man. He has a podcast on Ancient Faith Radio, Dr. Cyril Gary Jenkins. he makes a compelling case that Constantine was a crypto-Christian, that he was always secretly Christian, that his mom actually had him baptized, or not baptized, actually brought him up to be a Christian, and he believed in Christianity, but sort of kept it on the down low. So whether you believe that or not, but this man who's a professor, and I'm not saying he's right, makes a compelling case for that. So
Who
this
was that?
Dr. Cyril Gary Jenkins.
C-Y-R-I-L?
Yes, C-Y-R-I-L.
Gary, G-A-R-Y?
Yes. His podcast is called A Light from the Past. And you'll have to look through his podcast, but he's going to talk about Constantine. It's basically a history of the church. And he makes, to me, a pretty convincing case. Regardless, Constantine lived in a pagan society, and he didn't advertise his Christianity if he was Christian. His mother was definitely Christian, unabashedly.
So either way, he was heavily in. I'm
Oh
sure
yeah,
he was,
Mama has a lot of sway.
Exactly.
The story is that when Monica was in a convent and she prayed for her son
No,
for 20 years.
You're thinking about Augustine.
Oh, well,
Augustine.
sorry.
So
Constantine.
Saint Helena
Saint
is Constantine's mother, and we'll talk about her in a second.
Oh,
So Constantine is proclaimed emperor in York by the legions. So just so you know, the empire is weird.
Yeah.
For probably a couple of centuries now, the empire has had two emperors, co-emperors. One Roman Empire, an Eastern emperor, and a Western emperor. So you're already getting an East-West divide, Greek and Latin. This is already starting. There's two emperors, and then it got so unwieldy. Each emperor would have two Augusti, or an Augustus, under them. So you have two emperors, and then that splits into two more administrators, two Augusti. Anyways, what happens is the army is the only enforcer of power and authority in the empire. So you have these generals taking care of the army. I don't care what's happening to the citizens. The army is their meal ticket to authority. And all the time you're having various generals, or this emperor or this Augusti, who's very popular with the army, makes sure the army gets paid well and treated well, proclaiming themselves emperor. Because they've got 12 legions behind them saying that that's true.
Right.
And the legions are like, well, this guy's our meal ticket. Let's make him emperor. He'll make sure we get taken care of really good.
And one thing to remember too is, like, in that period of time, that's the majority of military forces
Oh,
in
yeah.
like the world.
Yes.
Like, yeah, that's like
And especially as
yeah.
far as a trained military force, you had tribesmen
Yeah.
who were in clans and fought as a family,
Right.
but the Roman military was a disciplined citizen army. Also at this time, most of the soldiery are auxiliary troops that are German barbarians. The Romans train and bring them in because the posh Roman citizens can't be bothered to serve in the military anymore.
Right.
I'm just
Remind you of
going to
something?
talk to you about
Yeah,
some
yeah,
parallels,
yeah.
United States going on.
So familiar.
And so you have foreign soldiers trained as Romans, in the Roman army. They don't care who's emperor as long as it's the guy taking care of them.
Right,
There's
sure,
no
yeah.
loyalty to the state, but no, like, I love Rome,
Right.
Anyway, so that's why what happens with Constantine. The legions declare him emperor. That happens sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes these guys had a tiger by the tail.
Yeah.
When they proclaimed you emperor, you decided to be emperor real fast unless you wanted to get killed. So Constantine is like, okay, I'm the emperor, and he's going to go and defeat his rivals. So he's coming from Britain, going across France, which is called Gaul, and his main rival, he defeats him at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312. Somewhat miraculous, like he had the smaller army, and by all accounts he should have lost the battle. I can't remember the other emperor's name. The guy was a moron. He basically, as I recall the battle, Constantine had a smaller force on this side of the river, and the guy had a bigger army, and he was crossing the river, so it was like a funnel, and Constantine just stomped him right there on the
And
bridges.
is that victory before the
No, so that's
Okay,
the thing.
yeah.
So this is, I'm just going to lay it out there. I'm not going to say this is historical, concrete fact. Before the battle starts, Constantine has a vision. One account of it is he sees in the sky like the sign of the cross, and it says in Latin, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign conquer. And he's needing a pep rally for his troops. So he's like, we're going to put this on our shields, and we're going to go to battle because this God has revealed himself to me, and he's going to favor us. And the Romans are incredibly superstitious. Others say that there were already Christians there, and they revealed to him that this sign he saw is the Christian God. And so, regardless, when Constantine wins this battle, he attributes his victory to Christ, and starts supporting the church publicly. Once again, Christianity is not made the state religion, but it is given legal authority, status, and is not persecuted. Constantine then goes on to defeat his co-emperor Licinius. Licinius was the Eastern emperor, and he started heavily persecuting the church, even after Diocletian, because Constantine was supporting it. So he hated Constantine, so he's like, I'm going to crush all these Christians. So there was persecution right before the council.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a slowly getting better. Constantine really gives peace to the church, and that's why the church has a council in 325. Constantine promulgated Christianity. His mother, Saint Helena, made pilgrimages to the Holy Land. She supposedly found the true cross. Leave that there. He was baptized very late. And some people will say that Constantine was really a pagan who just used the church for political support, and at the very end made sort of a half-butt profession of faith. That's not true. A lot of Christians, in my opinion, they were wrong, would wait towards the end of their lives to get baptized, because baptism is for the remission of sins. Constantine knew he was going to do a lot of killing.
Right.
A lot of killing as an emperor. So he was holding out to the end because he's going to have that wiped out.
That way I'm good before. Yeah.
Can be tricky.
So
That was
Yeah,
before
it's a gamble.
confession.
no, they had confession, but some people there is a sort of, just to let you know, there was a debate in the early church about how many sins could be forgiven post-baptism.
Right.
So they knew baptism gave you a clean slate.
Yeah.
And some of them, and this is, you could read early fathers in this. Some of them say, well, you can commit sins this many times and you'll get confession, you're good. Some of them are uber strict and like, after you're baptized, you have got to commit no sins.
No sins.
And
Sure.
so, eventually, and I'm thankful the church decided, oh, you're definitely going to be committing sin after baptism, unless you're an absolute saint. You know, the confession as a sacrament developed. Not that the church ever didn't believe in it, but it developed the way it was done. Early confession was public in front of the entire church, and the entire church forgave you. Later on, they realized this is not a great idea, because if you confess to committing adultery with this man's wife, there might be a fist fight in the church. Plus, you're going to be committing all these sins, and all these like kids hitting puberty are going to be like, I have never thought of that. You know, there's a reason it developed into private confession. So I'm just going to point out the sacrament of confession always existed, developed in the way it was used.
Did that kind of help, like, put a damper on that, the more hard line of, you shouldn't sin, or you can only sin this many X times or something? Because I feel like if you're confessing in a group, then the judgment and the kind of like barometer of every individual is also at play there.
Yes.
And there's probably a pressure on, well, are you going to really forgive them again for that, or
Well, there was
Yeah,
huge
yeah.
the Christian community would ostracize these people. I mean, excommunication was a huge deal.
Yeah.
There are stories of people who committed sins, gave their confession, and spent years at the front of the church wearing sackcloth and ashes, begging for entrance. The bishop finally let them in towards the end of their life so they could receive communion before they died.
Wow.
So if you think like what we do here is hard, no, it's not. And I'm going to say, in Father Josh's opinion, I'm glad the church doesn't do it that way anymore. So,
I am wondering, I don't know whether it was apocryphal or not, but my mother always told me that the founding fathers that were involved in the revolution would not take communion while they were in actual battle. because it would have been, spitting on the sacrament in a sense.
Well, good on them. I don't know if it's true or not, but I will tell you the church always, for a long time, completely frowned on being a soldier. And then, if you were a soldier, it was like, it took a long time for the church to accept soldiers into the church. So there's a whole thing with, there are soldier martyrs. The early church was far more pacifist than, obviously we had crusades. We're not going to weigh in on the pros and cons of that, but the church accepted soldiers at a point. The early church, if you were obviously a prostitute, if you were an actor, if you were a soldier, if you went to the arenas for the games or arena performer, all that, you were not a Christian. So it was a big deal for you to become a Christian, especially being a soldier in the empire could guarantee you citizenship if you weren't already a citizen. It was a good job. So it was a huge deal. But anyway, we got to keep moving to at least get through the Nicene Creed. All right. So here's the debate. Was Constantine actually a Christian? Father Josh is going to give you his opinion. Yes, Constantine was actually a Christian. May not have been the best Christian. But he was really a Christian. I believe that firmly. He wasn't a theologian. He literally, when they started the council, he greeted the bishops and everything. He sort of like weighed in and gave his 2 cents and sat back and let them do it. Because just to let you know, Constantine was like, what's the big deal with Arius? Like, why can't you just get along? I don't get it. I worship Jesus, the Father, the Son. I don't understand the relationship. Just get along. The bishops were the ones that actually hashed out the details. And they're like, it is a big deal. And
it's probably great, really, because,
Well, it's good that the emperor, and we're going to get to a new myth, the great myth, the new church. I got to address this. So there is a popular myth, especially amongst Baptists. There's what's called the Great Apostasy. So you had this very simple apostolic church that didn't have sacraments and bishops and all this stuff, and rapidly, as soon as the apostles died, it varies how quickly the church apostatized. Your hardcore Baptists will say immediately after the last apostle died, the church just went to the dogs. Others will say it gradually went to the dogs, and then Constantine invented the Catholic Church and syncretized paganism with Christian belief.
Ooh.
And one of the best memes I ever had saw was, it shows this, it looks like a Puritan to be like digging at the bottom of a tree, and the meme was, Pastor John buries the last King James Bible before Constantine and his Catholic thugs can find him. So I'm just saying, there's a lot of people that believe this. It is a
secular argument against
it is. It's a secular argument. It's a lie. It's a lie. Did Constantine invent the Catholic Church? No. It's a favorite myth of many people. Why would bishops that would rather die than throw incense to a statue of the emperor meet in a council and decide, oh, let's just let this guy introduce all this paganism into the church. We're fine with this. There's literally guys that came up to Constantine who were crippled and blind and their hands weren't working because they had been tortured. And Constantine would like kiss their hands and stuff like that. You can't tell me these guys were cool with paganism being introduced into Christianity. So things like sacraments, relics, saints, feast days, and a hierarchy all existed long before Constantine. They were in play in the church beforehand. They weren't introduced by Constantine. This was the first time, though, the church was able to talk in peace. So some of the practices of the church had been obscure, and some of the practices are going to be more obvious after this point. So that's just my spiel on that myth about the Catholic Church. All right. So we're going to talk about the context of Nicaea. As I've talked before in earlier classes, the early church, and throughout most of the history of the church until relatively recently, the church doesn't dogmatize things until there's a problem. Until a heresy crops up and contradicts something Christians have always believed, the church just leaves it be. So when you finally have Arius stand up and say, well, there's only one God. I know God, the Father is God, this Jesus character isn't God. He can't be one God if we believe in one God. He's got to be. There's variations on how Arians believe, but basically Arians believe that God created the Son. The Father creates the Son from nothing.
Yeah.
The famous slogan is, "There was a time when the Son was not."
Yeah.
Did not exist. And so the Son of God, and the incarnation of Jesus, is the highest creature. It's the most exalted of all creatures. And God used the Son to create everything through him. But he's not God like the Father is God. So that's what Arius is starting to preach. And just to let you know, the church had struggled to talk about the way the Son and the Father were related. Some of this comes probably from an early church theologian who was brilliant but troubled, and a man named Origen. You may have heard of Origen.
Yeah.
He was an Egyptian like Arius, and he wrote reams. We probably lost most of what that man wrote. So sometimes it's hard to tell what he actually believed. But there are some of his writings, he seems to indicate that the Son is sort of an emanation of the Father. And because of his close proximity, he's sort of the divinity stuck to him.
Yeah.
So you already have Christians struggling with how to relate the Father and the Son. And go ahead.
So how widespread were like all the Gospels at this point? Because
Very widespread.
okay, because
But
were they still
Jesus
troubled with it? Because I
says
feel
it
like it's
over
kind
and
of
over.
clear.
no,
Like,
we're going to get to that.
Okay, yeah.
So just to let you know, going to the Gospels.
I'm sure they,
By the time of Irenaeus, and Father Josh loves Irenaeus, that's where I wrote my integrated paper on for my master thesis. By the time of Irenaeus, the church is saying these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the Gospels, and there's no more. So very early on, the Gospels are being circulated. Now, and that's not saying every church had a copy of all four Gospels, but the Christian church accepted all four.
Okay. But there could have been more of a limit on like what the knowledge of all four Gospels and say.
No, I know. By the time of Arius, we have
okay.
basically the canon of Scripture settled at this point, at least the New Testament.
Got you. All right.
There's still going to debate about Revelations and the Book of Hebrews, but the Gospels, Paul's epistles, we don't have any copy of Paul's epistles in which they are not circulated as a whole.
Oh.
So very quickly, the church collected all Paul's epistles and put them in one bundle, and it just I want to point out, Hebrews always circulated in that bundle.
Oh.
So it's debatable who wrote Hebrews, but the early church didn't doubt that it was Paul.
Right. Okay.
So we'll talk. We can discuss that later. Anyway, so yes.
Can I ask a really, really stupid question?
Please.
I've been through this a few times with other people, and I just amazingly think about it.
Okay.
What is to be gained for Arianism to think of the Father and the Son in these terms over the way we would say
Right.
it?
They're monotheist.
Okay.
They would be like the Muslims or the Jews today.
All right.
Yeah.
They would say, we are monotheist, and by worshiping Jesus, you're committing idolatry.
All right. So immediately, okay. So they are definitely at that point not Christian.
Right.
It's not just that they understand the relationship differently.
Right,
It's
yeah.
just they are not
Yeah.
Christian.
And
Okay.
a lot of this is going to stem from, I'm going to say it probably came as an influence from Platonism.
Yeah, it makes
People
sense.
would view God as this perfect, absolute being that doesn't dirty himself with us.
Yeah.
He's perfect, he's unmoved, he's unchanging. So he has to have intermediaries, and a lot of the Gnostics
I was about to
speculate.
say, that's where it
There's
gets into the nonsense.
right, they have got like 100 of them. Well,
Okay.
Arians had the same view, but they had just one mediator. It was Jesus.
Yeah.
So they would say Jesus is the one mediator between God and man.
Yeah.
They have no problem with that. But God the Father has to be this perfect, untouchable absolute. And that's God. Anything else is a mediary. So they would be strict monotheists,
Yeah.
and they would probably accuse Nicene Christians of being of pagans or idolatry. So that's where this comes from. finally, the church has struggled to talk about relationship of Father and Son.
Yeah.
So Arius doubles down on there's one God and Jesus ain't him.
Yeah.
So
And truth to tell, it's a very difficult area
Oh,
to
yeah.
talk about. And the Trinitarian doctrine itself states it cannot fully understand because it is beyond human
I-
comprehension the way this
I
would work.
just so that you know, I'm a big fan of what's called apophatic theology.
Okay.
It's easier to say what we don't know about God than what we do,
Oh.
which is more of an Eastern position.
As long as you don't replace that emptiness with some person who thinks they know better
Right.
than you.
Well, so here's the thing about it. I believe the Nicene Creed, and I believe it teaches the truth about God. It does not teach the complete truth about God, because that is impossible.
And I guess part of my question about the Arianism is the same one I asked them. What difference does it make to me how I explain that relationship as long as I accept Christ as God?
Okay, we'll get into that a little bit.
Okay, and
So,
that's
but I'm
been
gonna
my big thing.
mention something. I had a discussion with a professor. I went to an evangelical seminary, and a great patristics professor, Dr. Fairbairn. He's evangelical. He is considered a world-class scholar when it comes to patristics. Orthodox and Catholics recognize this man as being phenomenal. And so I was very lucky to sit under him because I love
What's his name?
patristics. Dr. Donald Fairbairn.
Bear.
It's Fair, F-A-I-R, Bairn, B-A-I-R-N. Yeah, some kind of Scottish something or other. And we sat into classes, and he was very knowledgeable about the Fathers. And I'm probably going to sound a little arrogant, but probably I was one of the few students that actually had read the Fathers before I sat in his classes. Most of the guys are just like, I've never heard of the Fathers. Anyway, I talked to him, and he said that the Fathers had to define God this way in order for us to receive the salvation that we receive from God. And I disagreed with him. I still disagree with him. I said, no, putting the cart before the horse. It's very evangelical. Put salvation first. My salvation! You got to determine that. I was like, we understand God first, and that determines the kind of salvation we are offered.
Sure.
We don't start from salvation and work backwards.
Right.
Okay, so what I'm going to say is it's important to understand as best as we can the relationship between Father and Son, because it's going to affect our salvation.
Okay.
So for the now, you believing Jesus is God already distance you from the Arians. But if the point of salvation, and I believe it is union with God and growth in the life of God. If Jesus is not God, we are not receiving that life. We're not receiving the sacraments. Christ's sacrifice on the cross is not the sacrifice of God to God. It's going to fundamentally impact the way we think about our salvation if the Son of God is not consubstantial with the Father.
Would
So-
you say, talking about it's easier to say what we don't know about God, than we do, as long as we don't replace it, by doing like an Arian, heresy there and not acknowledging Jesus' divinity, you're closed and knowing more of God. You're closing off avenues of salvation, or how God wants to distribute salvation. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
cool.
I would say,
Yeah.
but once again, what you believe about God will affect every point of theology you teach.
Sure.
And it will affect soteriology, which is the doctrine of
And that's a
salvation.
butterfly effect in
Yes,
terms of
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
And,
I understand,
We'll get into that a little bit, but so if you were to talk to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, both of those groups claim to be Christians. I'm sorry, they're not. I would never give communion to either of those people. Their understanding of salvation, if you really sit and talk to them, is going to be different than ours. It is. Some of it's going to be bizarre, especially in the case of the Mormons. So, what you believe about Jesus and his relationship to the Father is going to have a great impact on what you believe about how you're saved.
And often you won't understand the impact until it confronts you.
Yes.
So all those doctrines around Jesus, they're tricky to talk about, and you don't realize when you go off track
Yes.
the consequences it has. And that was a slow development for the
So-
church to
So
figure
I want
that
to
out.
point out, all this has impact on our salvation. But if you look at the history of the church, none of the debates are about how you get saved. If you talk to somebody today, 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, "How do you know you're saved?"
Right.
Well, if you
Yeah.
died right now, would you go to heaven? That's so.
yeah.
The early church did not have that conversation at all, but they did have a conversation about who is Jesus. They all said Jesus is the Savior, but who is He?
Yeah.
Jesus' personhood, who He is, was far more important to them than will you be saved if you die tonight.
Right.
So, which is, when people ask me that, I'm like, you're just asking me the wrong question. The early church wasn't polite at all. You're going to hear them call heretics, like Nestorius. Later on, he denies. We'll get into Nestorius later, but they call him the God-hated Nestorius. They called heretics. They called you're insane. You're You're an insane blasphemer. They didn't mince words. St. Ephraim the Syrian, who, if you ever get a chance to read his poetry or his hymns on the Nativity, read them. They're wonderful. St. Ephraim the Syrian, hymns on the Nativity.
Thank you.
Basically, he said there's 3 ways to help, spread the gospel and to convert people. He said the lowest rung, the most, down in the dirt way, is to scare them with hell. You're becoming a Christian to try to avoid going to hell. He said the next best way to be a Christian is because you want to receive the rewards of being a Christian. You want to go to paradise and be blessed by God. He said the best way for being a Christian is because you love God.
Right.
Period.
Right.
So when all these ministers have these hell and fire sermons, I'm like, you're choosing the very least argument to being a Christian that you can. You're scaring people into Christianity.
And fear will eventually, in my opinion, exhaust itself.
Oh yeah, you can't keep
carry
it
that
up.
as a
And
faith
yet,
for the rest of your life.
Your
Of like just being
sermon
scared of hell.
calling out old Nick a few weeks ago was probably one of the best I've heard in a
Well,
long time.
I'm not saying you should. There will be times I will talk about hell.
Yeah.
And in fact, and this is a valid point. I've had Baptist ministers point out to me, Jesus talks about hell more than heaven. So our Lord did say.
I think you should have a fear of it. It's just
absolutely. I'll tell you. And I will tell you this. I no longer subscribe to the belief of what we call once saved, always saved. That I say this sinner's prayer, if I put Jesus into my heart, I'm good to go. I don't believe that. I believe salvation is dynamic. It's a continual growth in the Lord. I have far less fear of my salvation now in Catholic theology than I ever did as a Baptist when I believed I was always saved.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is as a Baptist, I always had to think back and make sure I got it right. I can't tell you how many times I prayed the sinner's prayer because I am OCD. I'd be like, what if I didn't really mean it? What if I didn't say the words right? So I do it again. And then Dad would get up and preach another hellfire sermon. Maybe I'm not really saved. I've been sinning a lot, so I'm just going to say. As in Catholic theology, I'm like, I will screw up. I will struggle. The point is to pick up the pieces and keep going. So, anyway, so
There's a question. When you're chosen for salvation, you're not really chosen for salvation. You're chosen to bear witness.
yes.